I hesitated to make this video, but I think it will be informative and interesting, maybe. If you watched my Vlogmas that I did during December, I did a big clean out of this space and checking out the books that I have. Now that I've been doing this for over a decade, I can see how archival the supplies I use really are and just how well my techniques have lasted over the years. But they do have some examples of learning something in each of them, so let's go through them. The oldest one, which I never made a video for, it was before I started this channel. I made the sketchbook for my graphic design job that I had at the time, so I took this to work with me at my regular 9-to-5. This is older than 10 years. So one thing I've noticed about a lot of my books past 10 years old is that the elastic doesn't seem to last. But it's not just on the books that I've made, it's on all my sketchbooks. I don't know what it is about elastic band that doesn't age well. If you've had that problem, let me know. This isn't from my use because I haven't opened this. The binding has still stayed intact, which is good, but the paper that I used on the cover was a pretty thin paper and it did wear a lot on the edges. I think this book could have benefited from some kind of corner reinforcement or some kind of protection on the edges, or maybe just not use a super thin paper. But the inside's not yellowed, pretty archived well. For the elastic closure on the inside, I think I used the Lineco PVA. I almost exclusively use that brand because it's such good quality. The thread on the binding is embroidery thread and it is waxed, and so 12 plus years, still holding up. This one you might recognize. I have a tutorial going over this whole making of this book. So again, the elastic is just like super loose. I don't know what it is about elastic closures that don't age well. See how low that hangs? But the vinyl that I used on the outside cover seems to be holding up well, and the construction of the book still intact. This is also made out of the same paper as the previous one that I showed, printer paper that I had at the time. And I also used this book as a work sketchbook. I did make a back pocket, which I also have a tutorial for. I remember this taking me a very long time to make because I filmed it. I think if I redid it now, I would do some things differently. The spine material, the paper was a little bit crinkled, and so you can still see that, and also the grain of the board. But like I've said before, I know grain, paper grain and board grain are very important in bookbinding, but I think like this still functions as a book. It opens, and if it's not easy for you to find the right size of board you need to follow the grain in the proper direction, you might have like a warped book. But if it works for you and if it still functions as a journal or sketchbook, I think it's okay. And I know there's people out there that don't like that I'm saying that, but I really do. I think if it works for you, do what works for you. Next book is also a tutorial I made for single sheet binding using a Coptic stitch method. And this is actually the one I'm kind of embarrassed to show because it's still holding together. The binding, nothing wrong with that. The binding's still there. In the video, I don't know if I'm saying it in these exact words, but if your paper is on the thin side, putting a piece of book tape around the edge of them will reinforce it since you're piercing through them and it's held by thread. So my actual book did not use the archival safe tape that I recommended because I didn't have any on hand at the time. But I wanted the viewer to use the proper material even though I didn't have it. The tape that I did have on hand was just shipping tape. It looks a lot like the book tape, but it is not, and I would not recommend using shipping tape, which is why I didn't recommend it in that video. And now that it's 10 or more years old, we can see what using shipping tape looks like. It's yellow. If something isn't the right pH levels, it's going to turn your paper yellow. And shipping tape is not meant to be long lasting. It's meant to go on packages that are thrown away. And so it doesn't have to be archival. And in the back of the book, there's some weird growth happening below the tape, and it's kind of nasty. And I don't know what it is, and I don't really want to know what it is. Even though the binding of this book is still good, I think I'd like to redo this book, or I don't know if there's any saving of that edge, so the whole binding would have to be cut off. Maybe I could salvage some of the paper because that hasn't been ruined. And also, if I were to redo this, I think I wouldn't even use the book tape because this paper is actually heavy enough. I think it would be interesting to see what this pH testing pen brings up on this book, so I'm sharing it with you here. This is a quick way to see if there are any damaging acids in your paper. If the ink shows colorless or yellow, that means it's acidic and will most likely yellow quicker over time. If it shows purple, that means it's acid-free and more archival safe. Testing the watercolor paper, it showed it was purple, so I'm thinking it must be the adhesive in the tape. I also tested the cover board, and that looks more yellow to me, and it's actually kind of colorless, so I guess the cover board is acidic. Maybe the acid board sped up the process of the tape yellowing the paper, I don't know. This was recycled from the back of the watercolor paper, and I do recycle board a lot. I use them for future book covers, so that got me thinking, are all my boards acidic? I tested another backing to a Bristol paper pad, and that turned out fine. It was purple. So I'm thinking it just depends on the board. This isn't meant to be used as book board, but I do anyway. And sometimes it might be acid-free, sometimes it's not. So I think this pen will come in handy to test my future paper supplies. Just a nice peace of mind knowing that what I'm using is acid-free. To show you another example, this is a book that I got at a thrift store that I was planning on upcycling, and it's a pretty old book, and this also showed a yellow, so this book is pretty acidic. I also tested my own pattern paper, which I sell in a Zazzle shop, and I am pretty relieved that that turned out acid-free. If you're going for an old antique-looking book and you want it to be yellow, then this might not be concerning to you. But if you do want things to last for more than a decade without yellowing, this might be something to consider. This one is also kind of embarrassing because I was so sure of myself in the video that I made. So I made my own version of a book that was posted on YouTube, made by Nifty. And I was trying to make a better version of that book. So my version, it's still holding together. That video, this was the first time I'd ever worked with this cover material. And I thought maybe I could get away with not using any backing on it. And typically when you use fabric, it has a harder time sticking to paper. So that's why, like book cloth, you want to have some kind of extra paper in between that and the board, so that it sticks to the board better. But I thought I could get away with not using it, and turns out I can't, because there are a bunch of bubbles, air bubbles, on the cover of this, which means it didn't stick to the board very well. It's more embarrassing because of that video. I was trying to make something better than the video I was basing it on, and I was so sure of myself. So that was a learning experience, and I think it's better to test materials first before you actually make a whole project out of them. And now the next book, I'll have to look. That's what's wrong with the book. There we go. So as you can see, that fell out. This synthetic thread that I used, it still holds up, and I think it's strong enough. I don't think it's waxed enough for this style of binding. I think the grippier thread, or even if there were some kind of notches on the spine piece that the thread could hold into, would be better. But I have learned since using this thread that I do still need to wax it, even though it says that it's already waxed. The beeswax just makes it grippier, and easier and more archival to use, so you don't have this problem. Like, yeah, it holds together, but it's not the intended binding style. I really do like this book still because of the pattern that I painted and the size of it overall, and everything inside of it still holds up, archival. I think we can rebind this together and use beeswax on the thread or maybe a different thread altogether.